Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the Acts of the Apostles. Today we're looking at chapter 14. We're in the middle of Paul's first missionary journey. You will recall in our last session together, Paul had been forced to leave the city of Antioch under persecution and harassment. But he and Barnabas had established a vital church there, and they continued the work after he was gone. Now in chapter 14, we are told the next 3 cities that Paul and Barnabas visited: Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. If you look at a map, these are simply all to the east of Antioch, and so Paul is simply moving along the road, going east, visiting each of the cities in turn. In each of these cities, he's going to establish a strong church. Now, we're not going to look at everything in chapter 14, but I do want to make a couple of mentions of things that are of interest. It says in verse 1 that when they reached Iconium, Paul and Barnabas, as usual, went to the Jewish synagogue. This is their pattern we've seen. They always start in the synagogue. It says they spoke effectively, and a large number of Jews and Greeks believed. This was the Jewish believers in the synagogue and the Gentile God-fearers. Then, of course, it continues to spread to the rest of the city from there. We're told that in Iconium, Paul and Barnabas spent a considerable time. They spoke boldly for the Lord, and the Lord confirmed their message, the message of His grace, by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. We see this over and over again, that the power of the gospel being preached by Paul and Barnabas is authenticated by God with signs and wonders. So a great church is established in the city of Iconium. But after a while, persecution arises, just as it had in Antioch. And so Paul and Barnabas move on to the next city, which is Lystra. Now in Lystra, we are told an example of one of those signs and wonders, one of those miracles that occurred. It says in Lystra, in verse 8, there was a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth. He had never walked. He's been crippled from birth. Now this occurs in the marketplace, not in the synagogue. We're going to see that. Now this man is listening to Paul as Paul is speaking and preaching. Paul looked directly at him, realized that this man had faith to be healed. So Paul calls up, "Stand on your feet, get up." And the man jumped up and began to walk. This is very similar to what Peter and John had done years before in the temple gate at Jerusalem. Remember when the man who was lame, Peter said, "I don't have money or silver or gold to give you, but I do have something. In the name of Jesus, rise and walk." Paul does the same thing. Stand up and walk. And the man began to walk. It's one of those signs and wonders. Now, unfortunately, when this miracle occurred, some people misunderstood in this city of Lystra. We're in the marketplace now, so there's a lot of people who are pagans. That is, they have not yet believed the gospel. They don't know the message of the true God. And so they misunderstand this miracle. It says, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates and were preparing to sacrifice to them, that is, to Barnabas and Paul. You see, this pagan crowd who had been raised in the Greek mythological religions of Zeus and Hermes and all those other gods, they misunderstood the miracle, not being introduced to the true God of Israel yet. When they saw the miracle, they thought these Greek gods had come down to them. When Paul and Barnabas realized what is going on, they protest. "Friends, don't do this," they said. "We too are only human like you. We come to bring you good news, to tell you about the true living God, and to ask you to turn from these worthless idols. God is the one who made the heavens and the earth, and He's given us His testimony by His providential grace over us." And so with these words, they had difficulty, but they kept the crowd from sacrificing to them. Paul and Barnabas are appalled that people would think they are some type of deity, and they quickly remind them that there is only one true God, and we are simply His messengers proclaiming His word to you. But then things turn ugly. Some Jews come from Antioch and Iconium, and they win the crowd over, and they stone Paul. Just a moment ago, they thought he was a god, a Greek god, but a deity. Paul convinces them he is not, and so they get mad, and they stone him and drag him outside the city. They thought he was dead. But after the disciples, the believers, had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city, preached the gospel. And the next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Another miracle occurs. Now, there's some who think maybe this was a resurrection, sort of like Lazarus, that he was actually stoned to death, and God raised him. We don't know. It may have been that he was just wounded and God healed him. But either way, it's a miracle. And he shows his courage by going back into the city and proclaims the gospel there. Then the next day they leave for the city of Derbe, and they preach the gospel there and establish a large number of disciples. So in this chapter, we see the gospel established in 3 more cities: Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Now, at this point, we're nearing the end of the first journey, and we're going to see in our next session that Paul and Barnabas decide to return to their home church of Antioch. But it's been a great mission so far. So far, they've established the church in the island of Cyprus, in the city of Antioch, in the city of Iconium, in the city of Lystra, and in the city of Derbe. Many more people have come to faith in Jesus because of this mission. This first missionary journey has been a great success. Now, next time we'll look at how it wraps it up and how Paul and Barnabas return to their home church of Antioch. That will be for next time. Today, I hope you have a great day. I hope you know the presence of the Lord with you, and I'll see you next time for our 5-minute study in the Acts of the Apostles.